gathering of folks that are interested in talking about higher education. And I am Janine Salman. I'm the state representative for House District 30. So that represent areas of Banks, North Plains, Hillsborough, and Beaverton. And I am excited about bringing this opportunity for a good conversation to talk with some of our folks that are in the higher education world. And I think that it's an opportunity to folks to ask questions. This is uncertain times that we are all facing. And I think that folks have a lot of questions as to what the fall will look like, how we will be able to continue that focus of a seamless transition of education for our students and for our adults that are going to be returning to the workforce in maybe a different area of learning. So thank you again for being here. I want to say that we're going to be hearing about, we're going to have Nicole explain in just a bit about how this will work. And I just wanted to mention that we recently had an education committee meeting, which Rep. Neron and Rep. Reardon and myself are a part of for the House. And we recently had a meeting, and one of the questions that Rep. Neron had asked was, how are we incorporating all the voices when we're talking about what's happening in the fall? How are we making sure that we're hearing from students, from families, from staff in making those decisions? We did receive some really good solid feedback. I think just today it came through from the Oregon Council President, Dana Richardson. That's not her title, but I think that's really, we will follow up and provide, rather than go through and read those responses. I know that some of our folks and our panelists that are speaking will be able to touch on some of that. But I do know that we will follow up with any information from this meeting from everyone that has registered. We may not have an answer for you during this process, but we will do our very best. And we will also make sure that we're following up with people to get them the answers that they need. I kind of am really incredibly honored to be in this position because I know that I consider myself very fortunate to be a community connector. And it does mean that I might not have the answer, but I'm going to connect you to a way to find the answer that you seek. So I know, and we know, that communities of color are disproportionately denied access to higher education. One of the things that I really appreciated was working and sponsoring a bill with Rep. Teresa Alonso Leon. It was a task force. I think it was House Bill 4160 in 2020. And it was about kind of looking at the Student Success Act model and kind of going to all corners of the state. And really, as they did with pre-K through K-12, through 12th grade, we really wanted to take this model and look at what would happen for our higher education. What are our students facing? What's our staff facing? What is workforce looking like in those areas, and what kind of training do they need? I was really excited about that, and I know that Rep. Alonso Leon was extremely excited, and we are still very determined to make that work go forward. I think it gives us a really good bird's eye view of what's happening in Oregon. So I think that right now I will just make sure, I will mention too that I serve on the Education Committee. I serve on the Energy and Environment Committee as the Vice Chair, and I'm also the co-chair of the Public Safety Subcommittee for Ways and Means. And so all our different committees, as we all know, the work intertwines and works, and we work together to help Oregonians in all facets of their life. So I am excited. I think I've probably said excited multiple times, but that's how I roll. And so I am going to kick it off to Rep. Reardon and then Rep. Neron, and then we'll go from there.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm so happy to be here with my colleagues and other education professionals this afternoon on this committee. I'm in my fourth term, running for my fifth, unopposed. I'll be there next time. And I really wanted to run for a 5th term because I really wanted to work on education funding. I saw what we had done with Student Success Act, and I thought, wow, we need to do that. We need to really beef up the programs and have more substantial funding for higher ed. That sounded like a great idea. Little did I know that we would have this pandemic, being in a situation where we're in, where the changes just to the delivery model are so great. You think about in the last, in like a 10-day period, community colleges, I'll talk about them, I know them a little bit better. Community colleges had to change from face-to-face delivery to mostly online. At Clackamas Community College, they had over 300 programs or courses that were dropped. They were all the CTE courses that are so important to those students out there. They were able to maintain 1,100 online, but it's that sort of an adjustment that happened in a couple of week period. So I really applaud the education community for stepping up, being able to do that. But it's not just the courses, it's all the wraparound services that go with that. And so they've had to extend their working hours. They've had to do more online outreach to students. And it's just everything that I thought should be enhanced already was really stressed out and continues to be stressed out as we go forward. Beyond that, we know that their revenue is down, not only the revenue from the state, but for services and fees that they do charge and so forth. So extra demands, can't deliver quite the same products that they used to or services. And it's just such a challenge. And so I'm really very concerned. I'm glad we're having this discussion this afternoon. I want to continue working on higher ed as we go forward. But so many competing causes. So we're going to be competing for limited resources when we do go to, whether it's a special session or in 2021 session. And I'm really concerned that once again, higher ed will take a hind seat to other programs, and just there's so many demands. So we'll just keep trying to support. I am glad to hear that we're reaching out to the community and trying to find out what the community really feels is important, because we've got a lot to consider, to say the least. So I'm going to stop right there. Again, thank you for having me and for being part of this conversation.
Thank you, Rep. Reardon. Rep. Neron.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm honored to be here with my colleagues to talk about higher education today, and I hope that we do get to cover a lot of ground. I see so many of the names of the participants today are people who can really speak to this topic in depth as well. So I know that we'll have insightful questions, and I hope that we hear from some of you as well. For those of you that I don't know, I am a teacher by training, and I left the classroom in 2018 to come to the legislature to fight for education funding. And so thankful that we were able to invest in that Student Success Act and really truly hold this core belief that we need to make sure that education is accessible and affordable from cradle to career. So I'm very proud of the work that we have done already in the legislature, but I do feel like we have not put the roof on the house, in that higher education and access to the programs that'll take people from a high school diploma to a living wage job is just not completed work yet. We need to make sure that that's stabilized, and there's a lot of work to do to get there. So really thankful to be a part of this conversation. Relative to this particular topic, the committees that I serve on are the Education Committee. As the Vice Chair now, I'm really thrilled to be able to represent teachers as the Vice Chair in our Education Committee. And I have been appointed to the School Safety Task Force. That's a passion of mine, to make schools safer places, not just in in terms of gun safety, but in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion work, making sure that we're appropriately talking about the social inequities and how we can support all of our students. I'm also really thrilled to have a mental health work group coming up that is in the works right now. We're talking about the scope of that work, that we'll be talking about how education intersects with our mental health conversations, our behavioral health, and really the fact that education separately now, education really intersects with so many of the committees that we have in the legislature, whether it's the healthcare committee or the judiciary committee, and a lot of the work that we do really intersects education to all of the issues in our classrooms and in our students' lives. So again, just kind of bringing it home to this topic, I'm thrilled to dive deeper today and hear what the questions are that are out there, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some and hear from the experts in higher education as well. But just please know that I am here to figure out the best path to making our higher education affordable and accessible for all students. And thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thank you, Rep. Miron. I just want to say too that we don't do this work alone. We have incredible teams that work with us. And I'm very fortunate to have my team working here with me today. Nicole Vargas is on as well, and she'll be explaining the ins and outs of this meeting. And then I have Mark Watson on as well, who is watching our live streaming and making sure that's going well. I do have 3 high school interns, and Lily Donis, Olivia Vargas, and Ryan Smith. And I think some are participating today as well. I'm really excited that students are a part of this conversation. So thank you so much for joining us. And Nicole, you want to take it away and share with us how this will work?
Sure. So after Representative Salmon is going to introduce the panel members, and they'll have a moment to speak and share what's going on in their communities, we're going to open it up for question and answer. And all the participants will remain on mute, but the chat is open. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen, you can see the chat button, and feel free to type questions there. If we are not able to get to them all, please feel free to leave your name and email with your question, and we will follow up with you after the event. That's pretty much it. Thank
Excellent. So without further ado, I want to just introduce our panelists that are here today. And I thank them so very much for their time in joining this important conversation. So we have Ben Cannon, who is the Executive Director from the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. And then I have President Mark Mitsui from Portland Community College. And then we have Dave McDonald, who is representing Western Oregon University. So what we'll do is provide them some opportunity to give some background, some information. I think we'll start with Mr. Cannon, and then they can run through, and then really we'll be opening this up for questions. As Nicole mentioned, the chat is open, but we also have some pre-submitted questions that folks did send us when they RSVP'd. So thank you for that. And without further ado, Mr. Cannon.
Well, thank you, Representative. Really appreciate the invitation to participate in this, and your leadership, along with Representative Niren and Representative. We just appreciate your knowledge, your experience, your passion, and your understanding of higher education issues. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this. So I lead the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. We're the state agency that supports higher education, community colleges, public universities, private colleges and universities throughout Oregon. And we do so through funding, through making some rules, through doing some coordination, through recommending budgets, and otherwise helping coordinate post-secondary education for Oregon. We administer financial aid programs that many students take advantage of, like the Oregon Promise and the Oregon Opportunity Grant. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes on sort of where we are, and several of you touched on this in your introductions. As folks know, I think in mid-March, the governor, as part of her efforts to help us to stay home and save lives, required all colleges and universities in Oregon to transition almost all of their activities to remote only. That meant for our public institutions really converting pretty much the entirety of their spring quarter instructional activities to remote or online modalities. So students and faculty and staff have been conducting college and university in Oregon since mid-March remotely, which is a pretty extraordinary undertaking. It's a transition that our faculty and students made in just a matter of days. And while I think it's going to take a while for us to learn and process on the results of that, a lot of it I think has gone surprisingly well. Our colleges and universities have continued to serve tens of thousands of Oregonians in spite of the pandemic. Learning continues to occur. Commencement ceremonies are taking place remotely. And students are getting those diplomas, and we hope finding themselves better prepared for their lives to come. That said, there have also been challenges, and they will be no surprise to many of you, challenges of access to technology, challenges of access to wraparound services and supports that students need in order to be successful, challenges in the provision of certain courses, particularly career and technical education courses, in an online environment where they really require hands-on learning that wasn't possible during the last couple of months. We as an organization are focused now on questions of the summer and the fall, working with the governor's office, our partners at the Oregon Health Authority, and colleges and universities around the state about to answer the question of what will higher education look like through the summer and fall. So we are preparing to release new state health standards for the safe conduct of in-person education, the resumption of in-person education at our colleges and universities this summer and fall, with protocols in place to support and protect the health and safety of students, staff, and faculty. So in the next several days, I expect the governor to issue a new executive order and the Oregon Health Authority to release new requirements that colleges and universities will have to build into their resumption plans. I want to be clear that the state will not be ordering our colleges and universities to reopen on any particular timeline. We will, however, be establishing the minimum standards that they will have to meet in the development of their own institutional plans for how and when to resume. And I'm happy to go into more depth about what those may look like in the question and answer period, but that's the general framework that we're likely to take as a state. Finally, I just wanted to note, and Representative Reardon alluded to this, the significant fiscal distress that the pandemic has created for Oregon families and Oregon students, or many of them on the one hand, and Oregon public institutions on the other. For colleges and universities, the impact of the pandemic on budgets was immediate and was significant. Whereas some public services, including, frankly, my own state agency, continue to sort of roll along with the budgets that were adopted last year, with an understanding that there may be cuts coming, but nevertheless, we continue to operate as normal. Colleges and universities saw an immediate and significant reduction in their revenues, and immediate and significant increase in their costs. And again, happy to go into more detail, but some of this is pretty self-explanatory. If you can't offer the CTE class, the student can't enroll, they can't pay tuition, and the college has a budget problem. If you can't house somebody safely in the residence hall, or you've closed your campus to in-person activities, that student doesn't return to the residence hall, doesn't pay the housing and dining fee, and you have an immediate revenue problem for your university. So that plus the potential for significant state budget cuts means we have colleges and universities that are facing some very distressing fiscal projections. And we look forward to working with the legislature, with Congress, in order to try to minimize the impacts of COVID on higher education. We know that access to high quality post-secondary education and training will be critical for helping lead Oregon out of the recession, past COVID, and into a prosperous future. And we know that repairing and restoring and extending our country's and our state's commitment to justice, commitment to economic mobility, and commitment to equity requires a different and better kind of higher education system. So that's the kind of work that we're engaged at and in supporting our colleges and universities at the HEC. And I, like you, look forward to the conversation this afternoon. Thanks.
And Mr. Matsui?
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Solomon, Representative Neron, Representative Reardon for this opportunity. I wanted to start by acknowledging the difficult time we are all in, and also the historic struggles that communities of color have faced, and the role that higher education traditionally has played in this country in sustaining the status quo. But as Representative Solomon noted, the opportunity that we have in as we change higher education to utilize higher education as a way of dismantling the historic racism that has existed in our country. So we appreciate all of your support, and Ben, yours as well, in the effort to create greater equity in higher education. Both Representative Reardon and Ben have already highlighted some of the key elements. So I'll just add a couple other pieces here. And as you probably know, what used to be called non-traditional students are our traditional students in the community colleges. Our average age is 28. A quarter of our students have children, 90% work, and we have an incredibly diverse student population to the point now where an increasing number of community colleges in Oregon are now designated as minority serving institutions. So as we take a look at the income level, first generation status of many of our students, it's unfortunately not a surprise that food and housing insecurity continues to be a tremendous struggle. Prior to the COVID-19, we commissioned a survey through Temple University across the state, all 17 community colleges, and found that 20% of respondents indicated they had been homeless. 50% of respondents indicated that they had housing insecurity, and 40% had indicated food insecurity. That was before COVID-19. We know now it's going to be much, much harder. And so our first challenge was, how do we continue support services for these students so that they can continue their education in an online environment? Fortunately, we had started about 3 years ago something called Pathways to Opportunity. Actually, Rep. Reardon sponsored the first House bill that resulted in this initiative. And what we are doing is integrated benefits programs like SNAP around students so that they can access these supports and continue to go to school. When you have a roof over your head, books in your backpack, and food on your table, you're more likely to be able to graduate. Just about a month ago, PTO, this project brought together Department of Human Services and the Employment Department to cross-train about 145 professionals from all 17 community colleges to learn how to help students access their unemployment insurance, TUI, TANF, trade adjustment assistance, SNAP, and other benefit programs, since all of these now are moving online. Second key element, Rep. Reardon talked about career technical education, and both Ben and Representative Reardon are correct. They took a tremendous hit because there are only, at a certain point, you have to turn a wrench, right, in order to be able to teach. Although I have to say, I did pop in virtually on a welding class. And so I do want to credit our faculty with doing as much as possible to move as much of the curriculum online as they can. But then you do get to a point where there's no substitute for the in-person instruction. And so we were not able to move all of our classes online. When those classes reconvene, that's going to be another challenge. So with social distancing, and I, by the way, support science-based policy. We want to, we're going to come back on the virus's timeline, not our own. And that means both PPE and social distancing will be important. And that adds to the cost. So let's say you had a face-to-face class in CTE. Normally you would have 25 students. To provide adequate social distancing, you might only be able to allow 5 in that section, which means you need 5 sections instead of 1. That multiplies your per course cost by 5 times in order to be able to continue to offer that face-to-face. So that's one thing for us to consider. You've already heard about the transition to online. I want to give a couple of examples from PCC, the institution I'm most familiar with. We moved about 2,600 courses from in-person to online and remote for a total of 3,300. In order to do that, we trained 1,800 staff and faculty in how to teach online and in a remote setting. We were lucky to have a robust online infrastructure for support. Not all colleges have that luxury or that opportunity, and it stretched us to the limit. Our online and distance ed staff were proud and very, very tired after the transition, and they continue to support that transition and to maintain quality. As Ben pointed out, we're doing all of this with less money. Yes, we took a hit to tuition. We are anticipating a significant drop in state funding. And we are trying to not put this on the back of students. I can't speak for all community colleges, but I can say at PCC, we are really, really working hard to not raise tuition. And that means then we have to cut in other areas. And 85% of our operating budget are personnel, right? So that's what we're looking at in terms of being able to balance our budgets, to be able to serve the increased demand, and to continue our value, supporting our value of equity by not putting additional pressure on students while providing support. I know that several institutions have been looking at how they're going to make their cuts, and they're all pretty much landing on the same themes around personnel. So I think we have to, if we can maintain support for higher education and maintain support for the community colleges, that will position us well to be able to then serve the increasing demand we're already seeing. In a call this morning with the community college presidents, we went around the room and asked, well, how's summer enrollment looking? Well, everybody's experiencing an increased demand. There are now, everybody's up relative to last year for summer enrollment. The demand is beginning to build as the unemployed, dislocated workers are knocking on our door and asking, how can you help me? We know from previous recession and recovery cycles that the jobs you lose in a recession are often not the jobs you regain during a recovery. There's an increased skill level during the recovery as employers and businesses increase productivity through increased skill requirements and automation. With the advent of developments in AI, this recovery could be very different than previous recoveries if we don't retrain our workers, right? Jobs that can be automated in this recovery are going to be automated in this recovery. That is going to disproportionately displace many workers of color who occupy in disproportionate rates these occupations, as well as our low-income Oregonians. And so if we want to create a better future during this recovery, if we want to create equitable opportunity, and if we don't want to recapitulate the previous mistakes we've made in previous inequitable recoveries, we need to continue to invest in the community colleges and our universities as ladders of opportunity. I just want to end by saying that the majority of our students live in our service area, and over 90% of community college graduates stay in Oregon after they graduate. And so to create pathways of upward mobility for Oregonians means keeping the door open to the community colleges. Thank you.
Thank you, President Masui. Now we will hear from Western Oregon's Mr. McDonald.
Thank you very much. So my role at Western Oregon University really is around strategic initiatives, and COVID-19 put a big capitalization around the strategic piece because we had to move from reactionary as community colleges, as our healthcare, as our K-12, to really a perspective planning for how we're going to reopen in the fall. How are we going to really position ourselves for the next 3 to 5 years? Because as President Matsui mentioned, we have to be ready for a recovery phase. And in fact, higher education has a lead role in that recovery phase. The students that President Matsui talks about at PCC are the same students that are at Western Oregon University. And in fact, we have dual enrollment agreements with 7 of our community college partners, which means we share the students during the same term in some cases. They'll be taking classes from both of our schools, which means we have to be linked up in how we operate, how we transfer credits, how we serve these students in a way that doesn't allow the student to get lost as they go from one to the next. And that's a real challenge because what the big thing that I'm seeing in the current environment, it has elevated the degree of uncertainty. Uncertainty on our budget, uncertainty on our enrollments, uncertainty on how we're going to be able to provide classes. Are we going to be able to do face-to-face? Is it going to be distant? Uncertainty over how our K-12 partners are going through this. My son is supposed to graduate from Western in 3 days. He'll do it virtually, and I feel badly for him and his peers because they will have missed that really incredibly important milestone moment. And as much as I enjoy seeing the representatives and my colleagues by video, it doesn't replace the face-to-face experience that as people we really crave. And in fact, that loss for him, I think, is symbolic of what I've heard from my students, because I'm talking to students all the time on Zoom. And what I consistently hear from the students is they appreciate the effort of the faculty and the staff to keep them connected, to transition to distance delivery, to do all that heavy lifting that my colleagues have already addressed. But they miss so desperately the face-to-face connections that occur, especially at a school like Western, where we really are smaller by design. And so that community piece for us is critically important to who we are as a university. So for our students, that separation has created a sense of loss in addition to the uncertainty on what the economy is. The other challenge my son faces, and all of our graduates face, is what kind of job is awaiting him. When he started winter term, he was anticipating having one of the best job markets for new college graduates imaginable. Job prospects, he was getting phone calls, those stopped overnight. And now he's facing an uncertain future in terms of what is his next step. Should he go to graduate school? Well, there's an affordability issue. Should he go try to find a job? The question is where and how and when. So these are a lot of the uncertainties our students face. And what we've had to do as a university is ramp up how we support those students. So clearly doing advising by Zoom, we've all become very proficient in Zoom, but the telecounseling, how do we help in the mental health aspect, supporting our students and their families going through stressful situations? How do we help students who are in stressful situations at home and now are forced to be away from their campus, deal with those stresses at home without causing additional problems? So it's been a series of these challenges that are heightened by the uncertainty of what tomorrow is going to be, because the disease is running this process and we're following the science. Unfortunately, none of us can influence either one of those. We have to be responsive to both in very intelligent and informed manners. I want to highlight a couple of things that I have observed, though, because we are in the knee deep or hip deep in the recovery mode ourselves. We are already planning for fall and winter. I had conversations this morning with my president about what are we going to do for finals in fall term. So we are, multiple terms out trying to figure out what's going to happen next. But what this has brought to light that on my campus and on the other universities, we talk regularly amongst the universities, the community colleges, COVID-19 has brought out the best of us. We have lifted ourselves to the point where students are now centered in every conversation. It doesn't matter whether I'm talking to my groundskeeper and asking him how he's doing, or talking to a president, or talking to Ben and his staff. Students are the center point of all of those conversations. And that's really rewarding. It's very encouraging. I think that for the participants in this chat, that's one of the things I want you to realize is that despite all the challenges we're facing, we've all maintained this focus on students, access to our institutions, equity in terms of their service, quality, and then ultimately their success. Touching really quickly on what next steps are for us, we're going to continue to have extra costs. We're going to continue to have higher costs in terms of cleaning our rooms, cleaning them more frequently, cleaning them more thoroughly. We're going to have extra costs in terms of signage or other PPE type things that we need to do to keep our faculty, our staff, and our students healthy, and our visitors healthy. So things are going to be different. We've already released our fall term schedule, and right now about 40% of the classes our faculty have said we'll teach them in person. Another 30% will be by what we call hybrid. So it'll be one piece that will be in person, but the rest will be online. And the remaining courses will be by distant. But every one of those courses that is either hybrid or in person can and is prepared to go to a distance delivery or remote delivery if the health requirements of the community warrant that. So we are going to be flexible with our students, but that's required extra planning by our faculty, by our technology professionals, by our advisors. It has really changed what we're doing. The upside of all this is that we've been able to do this. I've been incredibly impressed by how well we've done this. And so I am very optimistic that when a student comes to whether it's PCC or Western or Eastern Oregon University or any other universities, they're going to receive a very high quality education from people and professionals who really care about their future and their success. So with that, Representative Solomon, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you so much. You guys are a wealth of information and we really appreciate this. I think you guys have touched on so many programs, so many points of frustration, as you have said, that we don't control this, that the virus controls the timeline. And I think that has certainly added to the frustration of people not knowing. I want to begin with a comment and then go to a question here. I had this opportunity at Hillsborough School District. We have an opportunity to do a salutatorian, valedictorian lunch for the students. Well, we couldn't do the lunch in person, so we actually took the lunch to the households and dropped it at the door, pizza delivery. So I had that opportunity and I was talking with the students that I was meeting with, and they were like very concerned, holding off on some of their plans because they were curious if it was going to be an online or if a hybrid or what it was going to be. So we had students that were PSU, PCC. We had students that were going out of state, ASU. So I know that all these students, that's weighing heavily on them because of the student loan costs, that they're going to take on. So those choices are very real for them. So I want to mention that one of the questions says, how likely is it that Governor Brown would require Oregon colleges to conduct classes purely online in the fall? Is that still a possibility? Not sure if Mr. Cannon? Perfect.
Thanks, Representative. It's a good question. So our current framework for state oversight of colleges and universities through the pandemic assumes that they will have opportunities to reopen. They'll have to meet health and safety requirements in doing so. I think the only way that would change, and we would move to a situation where the governor believed she needed to continue or reapply the orders that we've been living under the last couple of months, would be if the virus returns, resurges this summer or spikes this summer in a way that requires a broader sort of stay home, reapplication of stay home orders. So I think that is not currently our expectation and certainly not our hope. But if you started to see that the state was moving back towards, you know, the world that we've been in, and certainly at least in Multnomah County, continue to largely be within, at least for a little while longer. Unless that happens, I think we will be in a resumption of in-person activities with some new constraints. And I thought Dave McDonald did a nice job of describing how one university, and I think many universities and colleges, are looking at this continuum of ways that they will be offering instruction in the fall.
Thank you so much. I want to really respect time here. So I want to mention that there was a pre-submitted question, and the question was talked a little bit about, I think that it was, I can't remember, it was Mr. McDonald or President Mitsui that mentioned, says, my question would be an operational question for college and university in the fall when schools open for on-site classes. I've heard that some of the private universities planning on testing students every week or every other week. Is there any kind of plan to do this or to take place in the public university system? Okay.
So, that's a great question. One of the challenges that we face is the state's overall testing capacity. So we have the ability on our campus to test individuals, students who are symptomatic. We are working closely with our county health authority to try to extend that testing. We will have a survey that all students will complete probably on a weekly basis, kind of a health survey. How are you doing? Kind of going through some of the known COVID symptoms. We're doing a major health education profile. So we're having students this summer in our community health program work with two of our faculty members who are trained epidemiologists to really build a campaign for the fall so that when our students, faculty, and staff come back, we can really put as a center point healthy and safe behaviors by individuals in a COVID-19 environment. The testing itself, until the nation has stronger testing capacity, we are all going to be limited in how extensive we can test on a college or university campus. As a result, we're being preemptive in what we're doing. Our housing, for instance, we are planning on all of our residence halls to be single room occupants unless students actively request to be with a roommate. So our default is going to go from a roommate situation, which we've done for years, to a single student. And we will have extensive takeout service from the residence hall dining facilities. So again, to try to limit the opportunity for students to transmit the illness between themselves. Those are just examples of the things that we'll be doing to try to maximize health for the students on campus.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to a chat question. Some countries are looking at starting school terms early and also having classes outside. Is this being considered?
Go ahead, please.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. We've talked about that this morning because one of the things the epidemiologists tell us is that there's likely to be a second wave in the fall. And so we're trying to build a schedule and routines that help minimize that and put us in a position where we can best prevent that type of a problem. So we are discussing what does our calendar look like, again, with safety as the focal point. President Mitsui?
Yeah, we are also we're not looking at holding courses outside at this time. We are aware there could be a second wave, and so we know that we have to be prepared to pivot if that does happen, and looking at different strategies. I know some schools look at hybrid as an opportunity to prepare an institution to go either way, so that if there is a second wave, an institution is better prepared to pivot to all online. So we're just trying to stay as close to the science as we can. what are the disease transmission modes, for example. Dave's absolutely right on about testing capacity and the limitations to that. So we're somewhat limited, and I think I hope that we're looking at this in a way that we almost have to assume that everybody has the virus and then work backwards, right? And make sure everybody has adequate PPE, that we're having adequate social distancing until there is a vaccine. We're sort of looking at this as pre-vaccine and post-vaccine in a way, in terms in practice.
Thank you. Thank you both. We have another question that talked about, what do you think prospects are for a stimulus for support for higher education with HEROES looking unlikely on the Senate side? And how will that impact education support in a special session? So I'm not certain if any of folks want to take on anything about federal partners and what they're hearing at that level.
Well, I'll start. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge, first of all, that the CARES Act was a wonderful first step, and be grateful for Senator Merkley for his leadership role in getting the CARES Act passed, and to have provisions in that act that really provided funds for higher education and for students. As the representatives know, legislation is a lot like making sausage, and so at least we have an initial part of that process with the HEROES Act that sits in the House. How the Senate responds to it is something that you all are far more experts at being able to answer, but we are very hopeful. We think that the CARES Act was a good Act 1, but just as this disease or this illness has multiple acts, we need to have legislation at the federal and the state level that has multiple acts to it to allow us to respond as the cases continue to become problematic.
Yeah, I would add that the American Council on Education is sort of the umbrella organization for higher education, both 2- and 4-year, and they are pushing the Senate to include about a $47 billion request for institutional support. And that support would be similar to the kind of support that we received in the last CARES Act. There would just be more of it. Part of it would go to students, part of it would go to the institution. What we've heard so far is that the Senate Republicans are pushing back and holding out for liability protections for businesses that reopen, while Democrats are pushing for this and backfill or state support stabilization funds for state and local governments to be included, along with support for higher education institutions being included in the next stimulus bill. So that's sort of where the trade-off is, and where the bargaining where the sausage making, as Dave alluded to, will be made.
Okay.
Sorry, timeline. They don't anticipate. The last I heard, they're not anticipating taking this up until probably mid-July or so, and then they have an August recess. So that means probably, if the governor's waiting for a special session until the end of the Senate deliberation, that gives you an idea of the timeline.
Thank you. I want to just give the 10-minute warning. We have 10 more minutes, so I want to move forward. I know that this actually will probably look very different to the answer to this depending on the university. There are some classes that are 400 and some are on the smaller side. So it says if schools open up in person on campus classes, while class sizes will be limited, will out-of-class events also be supported? And I'm sure that you can read on in the chat if you have, rather than go through that. Do you know how universities will try to support out-of-class resources, resume writing clubs, libraries, and other organizations? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that you'll see for the universities and colleges a continuation of what we try to do this spring and summer with as much distance delivery of that material as possible. You can do an awful lot on Zoom, so the resume writing, those things I think can be very easily continued on in a distance delivery. The guidance that we're awaiting from OHA does contain language and guidance regarding internships, externships, kind of field work that we know for a lot of our disciplines are critically important to the student learning and acquiring and mastering the skills, whether it be a technical education course or a course in anthropology or archaeology. And so we will continue to follow the science and the best health guidance to make sure that our students, faculty, and the communities they're working in are very safe. I mean, that's got to be paramount to what we do. Mark, any thoughts from PCC?
Well, I would agree that as long as we still are limited in terms, we're not in a full opening of phase 3 kind of reopening, then support services at PCC will continue to be offered online and remotely. For us, and Ben mentioned this earlier, the digital divide is our main concern in providing access to these services. So we're fortunate in that our our foundation put a significant amount of funding into the purchase of laptops and broadband access. We were able to negotiate an agreement with Comcast for their Internet Essentials program and provide underwrite access to broadband for a wide variety of students. And then we also were able to purchase laptops, Chromebooks for students as well. So once that barrier is overcome, it does certainly then facilitate access to online support services and activities.
Thank you. I wanted to add to maybe just a point, because we talked a lot about how much of the cuts that we face in higher education or the barriers that students face come to our communities of color. And so there's a program like Future Connect that really, I think some of you talked about wraparound services. Is there something that you could talk about a little bit about the Future Connect and how that's being affected?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for the question. So Future Connect is a program for first generation community college students. 85% of our Future Connect cohort are students of color. They are all first generation students and the vast majority are low income. What Future Connect does is to provide wraparound support services. And we have found that this approach actually at PCC doubles the graduation rates of students that enter into the program. And the secret sauce is the coaching. So each Future Connect student has a success coach, and that coach calls them if they don't show up. That coach connects them to support services. That coach provides the social capital in educational capital that if you had parents who went to college, that they would be able to provide. But if you're the first in your family, how do you fill out a FAFSA? How do you register for classes? What's the difference between an AAS and an AS degree? All of those sort of secrets of higher education are decoded by a success coach. And so it would be great if there is a state-funded program that supports this kind of model statewide in the community colleges for first-generation students. It's the First Gen Grant Program. And we hope that grant program will continue to be funded, excuse me, for a couple of reasons. One is that we know our K-12 system has worked valiantly to move online. We also know that for some seniors, there's just like our own students, a struggle sometimes and a challenge. In this senior year, we anticipate and want to prepare for an increased need for, possible increased need for developmental education. And we want to be prepared because it tends to be our students of color who enter into developmental education. And these are courses that do not count toward a college degree, but are intended to help get students to the college level work in math and English. So our community colleges, we need to do a lot more work on our DevEd sequence, and a significant number of students need to have some level of developmental education. And so a first gen program like Future Connect does help students to maximize their opportunities within the community college system. So I don't know if that answers your question, but okay, thank you.
Okay, it looks like we have another question here. Do schools plan to allow students to delay enrollment for a year? I don't know if there's a conversation.
Representative Solomon, I think all of us, all 7 public universities in particular, have exercised incredible flexibility in how we're working with students, because we know that the uncertainty we face is even more so for the students as they try to map their future. Without knowing each campus, I would say that the universities are very inclined to provide students with extra flexibility. My advice, however, is that for most students, that's not in their best interest to delay unless that delay period has something productive and meaningful engaged in. Because otherwise, it's like going from being a runner where you run every day and you stay in shape to stop running at all and then trying to get back into the race a year later without that ongoing conditioning. So for students who want to take time off, I don't know that that's always in their best interest.
Okay, thank you. I want to respect the time too. So I don't have closing thoughts from Rep. Ben or and Rep. Neron. No. Or Mr. Cannon, did you want to?
Sorry, I don't think you actually called on me, but I will say one thing, Representative. I mean, I think in listening to this conversation, I'm struck from Dave and from Mark with the sort of can-do spirit of post-secondary education. I'm not surprised because they roll up their sleeves and they figure out how to get it done. But I also think we shouldn't let this moment pass without registering real sadness. There was a question that alluded to the fact that so much of higher education experience centers on exposing students to opportunities outside the classroom. That is absolutely true. And Zoom and online and distance interaction is not an adequate substitute for those experiences. And we know that those experiences are especially important for Indigenous students, students of color, first generation students generally. So I guess the hopeful news is even when we were doing it, even when we weren't under these circumstances, we weren't doing it particularly well or particularly equitably. And now in rethinking how we connect with students and taking advantage of this moment and everything we're learning about this environment to rebuild our systems, hopefully we can make them more effective and successful and equitable going forward.
Thank you. I don't know if my colleagues have closing thoughts. I see that Courtney, Rep. Neron, did you?
Thanks so much. I just want to thank everybody for participating today and coming to ask questions and answer questions. It's a time when we do have a lot of uncertainty and we do have an opportunity to refocus our conversations and rebuild and really have that equity lens on our return to a functioning education system in person. And so I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. In the chat, I put my email address, rep.courtneyneron@oregonlegislature.gov. And I'll just say it's the same formula for Representative Jeff Reardon and Representative Janine Solomon as well. Our first and last name with that same formula. So we're available to you to continue these conversations. I am going to be engaging in a mental health and education work group, and it's come up a couple times today. We know that this is an incredibly stressful time for students. There are challenges with engagement with the materials, with the stress of what we're experiencing, that we already knew that mental health was a conversation that needed significant conversation in our state. So really thankful that we'll be engaging in that work. And if anybody on this town hall today is interested in working with me, I welcome that interaction. And I will say that our chair of the Education Committee in the House, Teresa Alonso Leon, is very focused, as are we, on having these student-centered conversations. We've heard it come up many times. We don't want this to fall on the backs of students. And how can we also overlay an equity lens? So those are the focuses that our committee will have as we move forward with this work. So really thankful that we've opened up so many of the important conversations today, and glad to have so many partners in doing this work. So thank you again.
Thank you, Rep. Neron. Rep. Reardon, closing thoughts?
I so much appreciate, I always learn so much from all of you when we have these talks, and I appreciate the questions from the audience. I am just, though, even more concerned than I was when we started this conversation, because when Dr. Matsui talked about CTE classes being able to accommodate 5 students instead of 25, we absolutely rely on those students to grow this economy, to maintain it, especially when 90% of them stay in the state and work. And we need to figure out a way to pay for that, to offer multiple sections of the same courses. And so I'm really fired up about doing that. I think that's critical for our economic viability going forward. So thank you for the inspiration, and look forward to seeing all of you again. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank all our panelists. Thank you so much for giving your time today and your incredible knowledge to these very trying times. Thanks to everybody who is participating and watching. We're going to follow up with a few things. I want to follow up with the answer to Rep. Neron's question about who's participating in these conversations about returning in the fall, that came from the Oregon Executive Director of Council of Universities, Dana Richardson, and we'll send that. I'll also send some links to the HEC resources. I think they're great. It's great information from their website to make sure that people have that at their fingertips. There's a couple of questions that did not get answered, and we don't want to ignore that opportunity. So one came in about workforce, and then you have that came in prior, and then we had one that didn't get answered here. So I think we just got a lot of conversation in there in the 64 minutes that we've been on. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Rep. Neron and Rep. Reardon and myself, we serve on the Education Committee. So these conversations help expand our lens of experience. And when we're talking about these issues, it's extremely helpful. So all of our contact information will be in that follow-up email as well. So thanks to staff members for helping. Thanks to our panelists, and thank you, audience members, for being part of this. So thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.